Угрозы нет, а система ПРО продолжает строиться. Значит, мы были правы, когда говорили, что нас обманывают. С нами неискренне, ссылаясь на якобы имеющуюся иранскую ядерную угрозу при строительстве системы ПРО. Ну так оно и есть на самом деле. В очередной раз пытались нас надуть. Сейчас построили эту систему, сейчас ставят там ракеты. Так? Но вам должно быть известно, что ракеты эти закладываются в капсулу, которая используется для пусков ракет средней дальности «Томагавк» морского базирования. Туда закладывают сейчас антиракеты, способные поражать цели на расстоянии 500 километров. Но мы знаем, технологии развиваются. Мы примерно знаем, в каком году примерно американцы получат новую ракету, которая будет уже не 500 километров, а 1000, а потом больше. И с этого момента они начнут угрожать нашему ядерному потенциалу. Мы по годам знаем, что будет происходить. И они знают, что мы знаем. Это вам только вешают лапшу на уши, как у нас говорят, а вы, в свою очередь, вешаете своему населению. И люди не чувствуют опасности. Вот меня что беспокоит. Ну как мы не можем понять? Мы тащим мир вообще в совершенно новое измерение. Вот в чем проблема. Делают вид, что как будто ничего не происходит. Но я не знаю даже, как достучаться.
My name is Trish Roberts, and you're watching Faint Signals from Vega. So, yesterday I was watching a Democracy Now! Interview with Daniel Ellsberg, who was the whistleblower, one of the most famous whistleblowers. He released the Pentagon Papers. He did a major leak about what was really going on behind the scenes from the government and the Pentagon during the Vietnam War. And but prior to him gathering that information, he actually had gathered, he was a nuclear war planner, and he gathered information about what Eisenhower and presidents after Eisenhower were able to do in relation to a first strike against, for example, Russia. And I think even presidents today, even Donald Trump has the ability. And by the way, they delegate, just in case there's a decapitation order and they're killed, there's a whole bunch of other people, and they're not sure how many, have the ability to order a nuclear first strike on a country. And the reason Eisenhower was, and I'll read you what this it's totally sort of disturbing account of this first strike that he was willing to do, Eisenhower. As I read this, you'll understand that why the United States, the U.S. empire, is so utterly, like Dr. Strangelove is so utterly, insane, and because they've been like this for 70 or so years, and they have used nuclear weapons already on Japan, even though they didn't have to. And they were just trying it out. They've also tried out nuclear weapons on U.S. soldiers, and I invite you to watch the Empire Files and their program on how the U.S. government has tested nuclear weapons on their own soldiers. So, that's not pertinent to this, but I'm going to read you now what Daniel Ellsberg said about what he discovered that the presidents could do. It was sort of like it was sort of unknown confidential information at the time, but Eisenhower didn't want to sort of gather a huge army. He just wanted to do a first strike against the Soviet Union at the time, and China and other countries in Eastern Europe. rather than do any sort of building up of an army. So he basically wanted to obliterate, and that was a plan to do that. If the US felt that, the Soviet Union was at all a threat, that was the plan, a nuclear first strike. So this is what Daniel Ellsberg said, and he's written a book called The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner, and you can find the whole interview with Daniel Ellsberg on democracynow.org. It's titled, Daniel Ellsberg Reveals He Was a Nuclear War Planner, Warns of Nuclear Winter and Global Starvation. And that was posted on democracynow.org on the 6th of December, 2017. So I will put a link to that and you can watch the whole interview. But here is an excerpt of the transcript, and the whole interview is very interesting. And it really gives you a little glimpse into, for want of a better word, the madness of US empire, how that madness has just escalated, but it was pretty just disturbing way back. So it's no surprise that it is like it is, US empire. And as US empire is in decline, which it most definitely is, and eventually it's predicted that China will become the great economic power. By about 2030, the US empire will have fallen. And, the way to help an empire fall is to, in some ways, destroy them economically. And they're doing it by themselves. But that's one way of, and that's what's happening to the US. It's being overtaken by China as an economic power, and because the US empire is threatening so many countries and interfering and meddling and expanding wars, other countries have sort of gotten together and formed alliances with one another, which is a very good idea, a wise idea. And, DPRK, North Korea, is just trying to protect itself. And that's why it has been developing nuclear weapons, because it's seen what happened to Libya and Iraq when they gave away their nuclear weapons. And it's already been destroyed once by the US in 1953. 1953 was the war that really hasn't ended, where the US basically destroyed a fifth of the population of North Korea and basically napalmed and bombed and basically destroyed most of DPRK at that time. So they remember that, and I don't think they want to go through that again. And if they didn't have nuclear weapons right now that were, a deterrent, the US would have already invaded, and it'd be a totally different story. And I invite you to check out a link I'm going to put about DPRK. John Preisner went there a couple of months ago. John Preisner is from the Answer Coalition, which is an anti-war coalition, and he says that they have free healthcare, they have free education. It's incredibly, he said he traveled widely in DPRK, and it's not at all as the corporate mainstream media present it. Of course, when you if you vilify a country like the corporate media do to help support a war and manufacture consent, that's what they've been doing to DPRK for a long time, because DPRK has not submitted to US empire. And that's what happens to any country that doesn't submit. They're constantly vilified, so eventually US empire can go in there, either do a coup d'etat, a soft coup, or a hard, whatever. This is what US empire does. So anyway, that's DPRK, and a wise decision to have a deterrent of nuclear weapons. But anyway, I'm going back to this transcript of Daniel Ellsberg and this totally what he calls an insane plan of a first nuclear strike against the Soviet Union, which I think is still in force from what I understand. And there's and basically it would have killed 600 million people if they'd ever carried this out. So he said, quote, "And that plan called in our first strike for hitting every city, actually every town over 25,000 in the USSR and every city in China. A war with Russia would inevitably involve immediate attacks on every city in China. In the course of doing this, there were no reserves. Everything was to be thrown as soon as it was available. It was a vast trucking operation of thermonuclear weapons over to the USSR, but not only the USSR. The captive nations, the East Europe satellites in the Warsaw Pact, were to be hit in their air defenses, which were all near cities, their transport points, their communications of any kind, so they were to be annihilated as well." And he goes on, Daniel Ellsberg goes on, "I couldn't believe when I saw these that the Joint Chiefs actually had ever calculated how many people they would actually kill in this course. In fact, colonels who were friends of mine in the air staff told me they had never seen an actual figure for the total casualties. We had exact figures of the number of targets and how many planes would be needed, and every sort of thing, many calculations, but not victims. So I drafted a question which the aide to McGeorge Bundy, Bob Corner, sent to the Joint Chiefs in the name of the President. And the question was, in the event of your carrying out your general nuclear war plans, which were first strike plans, how many will die? First I asked in the USSR and China alone, in the thought that, by the way, they'd be embarrassed to say, quote, 'We have to have more time. We've never actually calculated that,' end quote. I was wrong. And my friends were wrong in the Air Force. They came back with an answer very quickly. 325 million in the USSR and China alone. Well, then I asked, quote, 'All right, how many altogether?' End quote. And a few days later, 100 million in East Europe, the captive nations, another 100 million in West Europe, our allies from our own strikes by fallout, depending on which way the wind blew, and however the wind blew. A third, 100 million in adjoining countries, neutral countries like Austria and Finland or Afghanistan, then Japan, Northern India, and so forth, a total of 600 million people. That was a time, by the way, when the population of the world was only 3 billion. And that was an underestimate of their casualties, 100 holocausts. It was very clear that they hadn't included, I hadn't asked actually, what would Russian retaliation be against us and against Western Europe? They were thought at the time, wrongly, to have hundreds of weapons against the US, but they did have hundreds of weapons against West Europe, no question. West Europe would go under any circumstances. If we were defending West Europe, Germany for example, we were planning to destroy the continent in order to save it. 600 million, that was 100 holocausts. And when I held a piece of paper in my hand that had that figure that they had sent out unembarrassedly, proudly, to the President, here's what we will do, I thought, this is the most evil plan that has ever existed. It's insane. The weapons, the machinery that will carry this out, this was no hypothetical plan. like Herman Kahn might have conceived at the Doomsday Machine that he thought up at the Rand Corporation as my colleague. This was an actual plan for how we would use the existing weapons, many of which I had already seen that time. Excuse me. So this is Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers whistleblower. He was a nuclear war planner. And Daniel Ellsberg goes on to say that, you know, of course there'd be far more carnage than that because, you know, that's not including what that's not including, you know, the thermonuclear weapons, the smoke and everything going up into the stratosphere, hundreds of millions of tons, and that would take out 70% of the sunlight, and so most of the population on the planet would starve. And, you know, there's all sorts of other fallout too, you know. That's just, you know, this sort of gives you an indication, you know, the history of this country, that they were completely unstable and have been for a very, very long time. They appear to, the US empire appears to have believed its own propaganda that it's the greatest country and that we can't do without it. It's the moral center, and that if it's going to go down, everyone is going to go down. Or if it looks like it's being threatened, everyone is going to be taken out. That's very scary because that plan that Eisenhower had for a first strike, nuclear strike, which would have killed, eventually it would have basically ended the planet really, but it would have taken out probably 1 billion with everything else that's going to would have happened following that. That would have been a third of the planet's population, and then of course all the stratosphere pollution that would have, you know, ended most of the sunlight. But this sort of plan is still in force. It hasn't, and it's been passed down from different presidents, and there's more than one. You know, if the president is taken out, there are lots of other people who are delegates that can carry out that, and who knows how many people who they are. So that's quite frightening, and absolutely, as Daniel Ellsberg said, it's insane, and that insanity has just been passed along. You know, they don't care how many people were killed, as long as just with this, if they felt there was a threat to ending their and they weren't going, and as Russia has said, they will not do a ground war because they know they won't engage in that. They will just do an all-out nuclear strike because they know that ground war would not. They don't want to lose millions of people like they did in the Second World War, and they know that they wouldn't win. So anyway, how unfortunate this is. You know, we've actually gone backwards. And this is what happens when you have corporations running government, corporations lobbying and giving money to congressmen and, you know, and their weapons. They're the arms industry. And the irony is that Eisenhower actually spoke about the dangers of the military-industrial complex. You've probably seen that famous public talk to the nation about the dangers of allowing the military-industrial complex to, you know, to take over. Well, quelle surprise. They have taken over. So anyway, you know, and that old saying, whenever you, you know, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That's what the military-industrial complex is. That's what Raytheon and Boeing and all those arms industry people, they're rubbing their hands together, looking for new wars and, you know, anything to sell weapons, no matter what they are. So that's a frightening account that, we need to keep in mind. And that's really all I wanted to share with you, really, is that appalling account of the first strike. So anyway, that's it. So check out that whole interview. It's very interesting. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Viga. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/Vegantrove, VEGANTROVE. And I also have a page, faintsignalsfromviga.com. I'll put that in the information section, so please subscribe to that. Feel free to leave comments. And one thing I was wondering is, I wondered why Daniel Ellsberg didn't release this when he was releasing the Pentagon Papers, why he didn't whistleblow about this awful nuclear plan. So if anybody knows why that is, he may have explained that in his book that I've mentioned. So, but anyway, thanks very much for watching. Till next time. Bye for now.
The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. So you made copies of top-secret reports for plans about nuclear war years before you copied the Pentagon Papers and released them to the press?
Essentially my notes and sometimes verbatim excerpts, not the entire plans themselves, but on plans that were then unknown to the president, to begin with, to President Kennedy. I briefed his aide, McGeorge Bundy, in his first month in office on the nature of the plans and some of the other problems, like the delegation of authority to theater commanders for nuclear war by President Eisenhower, which was fairly shocking to McGeorge Bundy, even though Kennedy chose to renew that delegation, as other presidents have. But I was given the job of improving the Eisenhower plans, which was not a very high bar, actually, at that time, because they were, on their face, the worst plans in the history of warfare. A number of people who saw them, but very few civilians ever got a look at them. In fact, the Joint Chiefs couldn't really get the targets out of General LeMay at the Strategic Air Command. And there was a good reason for that. They were insane. They called for first strike plans, which was by order of President Eisenhower. He didn't want any plan for a limited war of any kind with the Soviet Union under any circumstances, because that would enable the Army to ask for enormous numbers of divisions or even tactical nuclear weapons to deal with the Soviets. So he required that the only plan for fighting Soviets under any circumstances, such as an encounter in the Berlin corridor, the access to West Berlin, or over Iran, which was already a flashpoint at that point, or Yugoslavia, if they'd gone in. However the war started, with an uprising in East Germany, for example, however it got started, Eisenhower's directed plan was for all-out war in a first initiation of nuclear war, assuming the Soviets had not used nuclear weapons. And that plan called, in our first strike, for hitting every city, actually every town, over 25,000, in the USSR, and every city in China. A war with Russia would inevitably involve immediate attacks on every city in China. And in the course of doing this, pardon, there were no reserves. Everything was to be thrown as soon as it was available. It was a vast trucking operation of thermonuclear weapons over to the USSR, but not only the USSR. The captive nations, the East Europe satellites in the Warsaw Pact, were to be hit in their air defenses, which were all near cities, their transport points, their communications of any kind. So they were to be annihilated as well. I couldn't believe when I saw these that the Joint Chiefs actually had ever calculated how many people they would actually kill in this course. In fact, colonels who were friends of mine in the air staff told me they'd never seen an actual figure for the total casualties. We had exact figures of the number of targets and how many planes would be needed and every sort of thing, many calculations, but not victims. So I drafted a question which the aide to McGeorge Bundy, Bob Comer, sent to the Joint Chiefs in the name of the President. And the question was, in the event of your carrying out your general nuclear war plans, which were first strike plans, how many will die? First, I asked, in the USSR and China alone. In the thought that, by the way, they'd be embarrassed to say, we have to have more time. We've never really calculated that. I was wrong, and my friends were wrong in the Air Force. They came back with an answer very quickly. 325 million people in the USSR and China alone. Well, then I asked, all right, how many altogether? And a few days later, 100 million in East Europe, the captive nations, another 100 million in West Europe, our allies, from our own strikes, by fallout, depending on which way the wind blew. And however the wind blew, a third 100 million in adjoining countries, neutral countries like Austria and Finland, or Afghanistan then, Japan, northern India, and so forth. A total of 600 million people. That was a time, by the way, when the population of the world was 3 billion. And that was an underestimate of their casualties, 100 holocausts. It was very clear that they hadn't included, I hadn't asked actually, what would Russian retaliation be against us and against West Europe. They were thought at that time, wrongly, to have hundreds of weapons against the US, but they did have hundreds of weapons against West Europe. No question West Europe would go under any circumstances. If we were defending West Europe, Germany, for example, we were planning to destroy the continent in order to save it. 600 million, that was 100 holocausts. And when I held the piece of paper in my hand that had that figure, that they'd sent out unembarrassedly, proudly to the president, here's what we will do, I thought, this is the most evil plan that has ever existed. It's insane. The weapons, the machinery that will carry this out, this is no hypothetical plan like Herman Kahn might have conceived at the Doomsday Machine that he thought up at the Rand Corporation as my colleague. This was an actual war plan for how we would use the existing weapons, many of which I'd seen already that time.
Well, Dan Ellsberg, the colossal carnage that they were envisioning as a result of this first strike use was made doubly worse, as you reveal, by the fact that the image that we have that the president is the one who holds the switch or has his hand on the button is not true. That there many people have the capacity to initiate a nuclear war. If you could talk about that as well.
To start with, even if it were only the president, no one man, really no one nation, should have the ability even to threaten or to carry out 100 holocausts at his will. That machinery should never have existed, and it does exist right now, and every president has had that power, and this president does have that power. But the recent discussions of that, which emphasize his sole authority to do that, don't take account of the fact that he has authority to delegate. And he has delegated. Every president has delegated. I don't know the details of what President Trump has done or since the Cold War. Every president in the Cold War, right through Carter and Reagan, had delegated, in fact, to theater commanders in case communications were cut off. That means that the idea that the president is the only one with sole power to issue an order that will be recognized as an authentic, authorized order is totally false. How many fingers are on buttons? Probably no president has ever really known the details of that. I knew in '61, for example, that Admiral Harry D. Felt in CINCPAC, Commander-in-Chief Pacific, for whom I worked as a researcher, had delegated that to his 7th Fleet, down to various commanders, and they in turn had delegated down to people. So when you say how many altogether feel authorized if their communications are cut off, and that happened part of every day in the Pacific when I was there. Communications got better, but the delegations never changed. We've never allowed it to be possible that an enemy could paralyze our retaliation by hitting our president or our command and control, and neither did the Russians. When President Carter and then President Reagan advertised the fact that their plans emphasized decapitation, hitting Moscow above all, which the French and British always planned to do, by the way, with their smaller forces. And when that became clear, the Russians instituted what they called a dead hand, a perimeter system in Russian, which assured that if Moscow was destroyed, other commanders would have the power and would be told to launch their strikes. There was even a plan to do that automatically by computer, as a number of our military always recommended, to make the whole thing computerized, as in the Doomsday Machine of Herman Kahn and Stanley Kubrick. But generally, they allow for lower-level majors, colonels, to decide the time has come, we've lost our commanders, the time has come to go. That's almost certainly true in North Korea right now.
So when you heard about President Trump having that meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the summertime, the one where allegedly, I mean, Rex Tillerson has not confirmed or denied this, he called the president an effing moron. That apparently was in response to Trump asking 3 times in that meeting, if we have nuclear weapons, why don't we use them?
Well, he had asked that allegedly, according to Joe Scarborough and others, to people during the campaign a year earlier. And an answer to that, of course, is you will use them. And he is using them right now. It's not a question of whether the president might use them. He's using them the way you use a gun when you point it at somebody in a confrontation, whether or not you pull the trigger. And both Trump and Kim are using their weapons in that encounter right now, as many presidents have done, as I discovered later, as there's a chapter in the book, of a couple dozen, perhaps 3 dozen cases, mostly in secret, where presidents have actually pointed the gun, aside from wearing it ostentatiously on their hip at all times, as in NATO. I think one of our commanders just said, oh, we use the weapons every day, every hour of the day, which is true. We use them on the hip. But at the moment, they're being pointed. And they're being pointed by 2 people who are giving very good imitations of being crazy. That's dangerous. I hope they're pretending. They might be pretending, but to pretend to be crazy with nuclear weapons is not a safe game. It's a game of chicken, nuclear chicken.
Well, this is an excerpt of President Kennedy's address to the nation at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, perhaps the closest the United States has ever come to nuclear war.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
So that was President Kennedy. Can you talk about your own experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962? Talk about what you were doing. This is before you released the Pentagon Papers, years later.
I listened to the president on October 22nd. I remember announcing that there were missiles in Cuba. And I called up my friend, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Harry Rowan, later president of RAND, and asked, do you need some help out there? And he said, get on the next plane, which I did. I flew out to Washington then the next morning early, got into the Pentagon, the day actually that the blockade was instituted. No, the day before, actually. And given the task, for example, since I was a command and control specialist of, that's how I got into nuclear planning, what can the Russians do with 30-some missiles on Cuba? Well, they can hit Moscow. I'm sorry, they can hit Washington. They can hit Washington, which is what our Joint Chiefs would do, and they could hit various other places. And that, I knew, would not paralyze our response. It would only make it quickly carried out against all the cities in Russia and China and so forth. It would do them no good, but that's probably what they would do and so forth. I worked during that week. Some nights I slept in the office of Assistant Secretary of Defense Paul Nitze, and on a couch. in his office while I was on several task forces working for the executive committee, the ExComm, of the National Security Council. Now, the next year, I spent studying a great deal on that crisis with higher than top secret access on the whole, and yet I didn't learn many of the things that are most important about that crisis, which have taken decades and decades to come out of secrecy. For one thing, I've concluded, contrary to what I thought at the time, that both President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev were determined not to carry out the threats they were making of armed conflict. Compare it to the North Korean crisis right now. Imagine that both sides have decided they are absolutely not going to armed conflict. They're only gesturing and breastfeeding and trying to get the other side to back down. That's what was happening in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And yet, to make the threats credible, Khrushchev was maneuvering submarines within the range of our forces, armed with nuclear torpedoes we didn't know they had at all. And they were subject to mock depth charges to bring them to the surface, with our Navy not knowing that they were facing submarines that could blow them all out of the water. Kennedy, on the other hand, was moving troops exactly like those exercises. As a matter of fact, we had done exercises just before the crisis broke of invading Cuba, not named Cuba. The enemy they were against was announced to the papers as Ortsak, which, as Khrushchev inferred cleverly, was Castro spelled backwards. He said, yes, that was a game we used to play when I was a kid, said Khrushchev. So here we were threatening to invade Cuba. It was not a way to keep the Cubans from acquiring a deterrent force, just as our exercises of invading North Korea, going on right now, essentially, don't seem a very well-chosen way to get Kim Jong-un to give up his deterrent capability in North Korea. But that's what we were doing.
Did you say
the other thing I learned was that in the course of these maneuvers, we came within a hair's breadth of blowing the world up, of having the plans I've just described go into action. A nuclear submarine, I should say a submarine that was armed with nuclear torpedoes, had the two top commanders who thought they were going to go down, actually, as a result of these mock depth charges that were actually meant to force them to the surface. The commander, Savitsky, ordered the nuclear torpedo armed and ready for action against the destroyers or the cruiser. The second in command, whose assent was needed, agreed with him, and they were ready to go. It happened that a commodore of the several submarines in the area was on that sub rather than some other one. It could have been one of the others, but he was there. And since he was the Commodore, his assent was also needed. And he said no. And thanks to that man, Vasily Arkhipov, we didn't blow a cruiser out of the water and cause the nuclear explosion that Kennedy had already announced would cause an all-out attack on the Soviet Union.
And you say that you only learned years later that Khrushchev himself had again delegated authority to these folks to start a war?
Some of the things we learned relatively recently in the 90s and confirmed just in this century were that Khrushchev had not only managed to get nuclear warheads to the medium-range missiles that he had put in Cuba, which, by the way, were the exact counterpart of what Kim Jong-un is trying to do now. Khrushchev had decided that his ability to destroy our allies directly with his medium-range missiles in Europe, which we could not find and destroy, mobile missiles, he could kill 100 million and more in Europe. That didn't seem to be phasing us in Berlin. It wasn't getting us out of Berlin. It wasn't getting us determined to keep access to Berlin, even though doing that would force us to go to tactical nuclear war. So he said, I have to have missiles in range of the U.S. And so he moved missiles to Cuba, medium-range missiles that would be in range of the U.S. Kim does not have a Cuba now to put, and probably couldn't anyway in the case of Cuba. So he's building ICBMs that can reach the U.S., even though he can already destroy entirely our ally in South Korea and in Japan. So he's doing what Khrushchev did, and it's dangerous, as it was for Cuba, for Khrushchev at that time. Okay, Moreover, we had no idea at that time, though it was the most surveilled island in the history of the world. U-2s and satellites were flying over it, and even low-level reconnaissance planes that managed not to discover that he had put tactical nuclear weapons, short-range weapons, in Cuba. We didn't know they were there. And moreover, he'd done what we thought was unthinkable for a Russian dictator who wanted central control of everything. He and his presidium had delegated the use of those weapons against our invasion fleet to the local commanders. Now, that's almost necessary tactically. You can't wait on Moscow if an invasion fleet is coming at you. But we didn't think he would ever do that. His theory was, Khrushchev, and Khrushchev was a very smart man, actually, and his theory was, and the Presidium theory, they can't reach Miami. These are only tactical missiles, short-range missiles. They can only blow the invasion fleet out of the water, kill 100,000 Americans, and let it stop there. It won't escalate further. When McNamara learned that 30 years later, he said, that's insane to think that we could lose 100,000 men and not go to all-out war against the Soviet Union. And it was insane. Kim Jong-un seems to have a very similar belief that he could initiate war against our forces in South Korea and keep it limited. That's insane. But it's no more insane than our plans to initiate nuclear war against Russia, which would kill nearly everyone in the world.
We're going to go to break, then come back to our conversation. We're talking with Daniel Ellsberg. Yes, he leaked the Pentagon Papers in 1971, but his new book is called The Doomsday Machine: Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. And yes, that is what he did as well. He was involved in planning for nuclear war. Ellsberg reveals he also made copies of top-secret reports on plans for nuclear war. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we're spending the hour with Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers in 1971. His new book is The Doomsday Machine: Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. Ellsberg reveals he also made copies of top-secret reports on plans for nuclear war. I want to turn to a clip from the film Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, directed by Stanley Kubrick. Ellsberg has joked that it could be a documentary. The black comedy was released in 1964, just 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The film centers on a nuclear crisis that begins when a U.S. bomber plane loaded with nuclear weapons is on a routine flight pattern near the Soviet Union at the time, when it receives orders to carry out Wing Attack Plan R. That's nuclear war from lunatic General Jack D. Ripper, using the pre-delegated authority given to him in case of an attack on Washington. Much of the film takes place in the war room, where the president meets his top Pentagon advisors who want to proceed with the attack despite his hesitation. They hit a snag when the Soviet ambassador informs them of Russia's new weapon, a doomsday machine that'll destroy the entire world if they're attacked. So in this scene from the film, we're in the war room when the president's advisor, Dr. Strangelove, is asked to describe the doomsday machine based on a study he commissioned from the so-called Bland Corporation.
But how is it possible for this thing to be triggered automatically and at the same time impossible to untrigger?
Mr. President, it is not only possible, it is essential. That is the whole idea of this machine, you know. Deterrence is the art of producing in the mind of the enemy the fear to attack. And so, because of the automated and irrevocable decision-making process which rules out human meddling, the doomsday machine is terrifying. It's simple to understand and completely credible and convincing.
Gee, I wish we had one of them doomsday machines.
That's a clip from the 1964 film, Dr. Strangelove, about the Doomsday Machine, which is also the title of our guest Dan Ellsberg's new book, The Doomsday Machine: Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. Your colleague at the the Rand Corporation is the one who coined that term?
Herman Kahn invented that idea. And he said, by the way, that it killed so many people, everyone actually, that no one ever would produce such a machine. He said it doesn't exist and it never would exist. He said that in 1959 and 60. He was wrong. it did exist at that time, and it's existed ever since. We didn't know that for another 20 years. We didn't know that the weapons we had targeted on all these cities, and by the way, I tried to change that under Secretary McNamara. I said, have a withhold option against all the cities here. You know, why are we killing the cities here, either in retaliation or at least of all in a first strike, which would force them, or which would cause them certainly to hit our cities inevitably, which they probably will do anyway. But this gives them no incentive to refrain from our cities, whatever. Why are we hitting Moscow? How do you possibly ever get the war stopped? How can you possibly get it limited? How could they surrender or the war end in any way if you hit their central command? And that seemed to make some sense, and there was a withhold option against that, never implemented. When Cheney came in years later, he was amazed to discover how many weapons were still targeted on Moscow, and we're talking about hundreds here, which seemed crazy to me. Anyway, the system, however, as I've already said, they did plan that they were going to kill, I said 600 million, but actually they weren't including the effects of fire. They never have, because it's too incalculable in the weather and the inflammable materials and so forth. Actually, that's the biggest effect of thermonuclear weapons. So the number would really have been at that time well over 1 billion, plus the Soviet retaliation against Europe. So we're talking about over 1 billion people, a third of the Earth's population at that time. And I've actually heard Edward Teller, one of the sources of Dr. Strangelove, fictional Dr. Strangelove, the father of the H-bomb Teller, say, at most, thermonuclear weapons could cause the deaths of 1/3 of the population, very close to what the Joint Chiefs had said. I thought of that as the glass 2/3 full when I heard him say that. But the fact is, he was wrong. And Khan was wrong. Nobody's perfect. In fact, it would be 3/3. The fact is that the weapons on these cities, which continued always, despite the supposed withholding option, to be targeted on military targets in the cities. The cities would burn, nevertheless. And not only would there be fire, that were not in the calculations, there would be smoke, surprise. And the firestorms that would be caused by these simultaneous widespread fires, as in the Tokyo firestorm of March 9th and 10th, 1945, there were only 3 so-called firestorms in World War II, Hamburg, Dresden, and Tokyo, where the fires were so widespread that they caused the column of air to rise abruptly very high into the stratosphere. And what had not been calculated before, till 1983, was that the millions and millions, possibly 100 million tons of smoke and black soot would be lofted into the stratosphere, where it would not be rained out ever, and it would spread quickly around the world, causing a blanket that would destroy, or rather absorb, most of the sunlight from reaching the Earth, 70% of the sunlight, killing all the harvests worldwide, and preventing any vegetation, starving everyone on Earth, essentially. Nearly everyone, let me correct that. Carl Sagan, when he first was reporting this in 1983, more than a third of a century ago, said extinction was possible. The latest calculations show no. Extinction is very unlikely. We're so adaptable. We can live in tip of New Zealand eating mollusks, some millions of people. But 98% or 99% of the people will go near extinction, close enough to be called a doomsday machine. And that is what both U.S. and Russia have still on hair triggers, with the delegation, with launch on warning, with ICBMs on both sides that are vulnerable to attack by the other, and therefore have the incentive to use them or lose them if there's warning of an attack on the way. Now, false warnings have occurred on both sides repeatedly and gone into several minutes. In 1995, several years after the Cold War was over, Premier Yeltsin, for the first time, either side, was shown his briefcase and the buttons that he would push to launch nuclear warning because of what was, in fact, a Norwegian weather rocket that was mistaken for a rocket that might be headed at Moscow for decapitation. And he hesitated, Yeltsin, at that time, long enough that the missile would have arrived, and they decided it was a false alarm. If he had not, we wouldn't be here, because the nuclear winter resulting from the attack on one side or both would have produced smoke that long ago would have starved us and nearly everyone else on Earth.
So when you hear the news accounts now of the threats of North Korea and the response of the president that he'll rain fire and fury on the Korean Peninsula, what's your reaction to the nature of the debate now? Because I would think that back in the 80s, the public consciousness of nuclear winter, of the dangers of nuclear weapons, seemed a lot greater throughout the United States than it is today.
Well, these are the first threats that any American president, and American presidents have made many nuclear threats, as we said earlier in the past. These are the first ones since the Cuban Missile Crisis more than half a century ago against the nuclear weapons state. Harry Truman made nuclear threats 67 years ago against North Korea. But North Korea wasn't a nuclear state then. And by the way, we didn't need nuclear weapons to bring fire and fury like the world had never seen, except in Tokyo and Dresden and Hamburg. We burned North Korea to the ground without using nuclear weapons at that time. Left not a stick of man-made structure left standing in North Korea. So they all remember that. If they're President Trump's age or older, actually, he was 4 at the time, but that was indelible memory. They can believe we would do that. But now they have nuclear weapons. If they were smart, they wouldn't send them back at us, because that would be sheer suicide for them. Every man, woman, and child in North Korea, as he's implied, would be killed. Should we count that they won't do that? That they won't retaliate to our strike? No. He's not going to take his nuclear weapons entirely out of Korea as we have these exercises. He thinks he would be crazy to do that. It would be suicidal, and that's not the kind of crazy he is. The kind he is the kind we are, which is nuclear weapons are to be met or even preempted with nuclear weapons. That striking first is better than striking second, and striking second is better than not striking at all. It's crazy, but we've shown that kind of craziness for 70 years.
You have called for whistleblowers to come forward. I wanted to play a clip of, well, you have said that the Army whistleblower, Chelsea Manning, who is now out of jail, who spent 7 years behind bars and leaked more than 700,000 classified files and videos to WikiLeaks about U.S. foreign policy in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Manning had been sentenced to 35 years in prison in 2013 after she was convicted under the World War I-era Espionage Act. In January, President Obama commuted her sentence shortly before leaving office. She was the longest-held whistleblower in U.S. history. After her release, Manning spoke with ABC News about her decision to become a whistleblower.
Getting all this information, and it's just death, destruction, mayhem, and eventually you just stop. I stopped seeing just statistics and information, and I started seeing people.
There are those who say you may have been motivated to get the information into the public sphere, but you might have also given it to our enemies.
Right, but I have a responsibility to the public. You know, it's not just about, we all have a responsibility.
So that was Chelsea Manning. Dan Ellsberg, you've called in your book for other people to, in positions, to raise the alarm about nuclear weapons. You visited Ed Snowden in Russia. What kind of information would you like to see released now?
Well, let me say, first of all, Chelsea Manning and Ed Snowden are heroes of mine. And at the same time, I can say I identify more with them than with any other people on Earth, because they went through the same process of challenge that I did and made the same kind of decisions. I would say to people who were in her position or Ed Snowden's position, especially in a high position right now, if you are aware of documents, and I'm certain these documents exist in the Pentagon, in CIA, in the White House, that show the true scale of the horrors, the damage, the devastation that would occur if President Trump were to carry out his threats of armed conflict, armed action against this nuclear state, against North Korea. I'm sure, by the way, that these estimates exist.
Do you think it's going to be North Korea? Do you think it could be Russia? I know, I mean, given
see,
all the controversy, or Iran?
Yeah, of course. Any of those, if there was a chance of initiating nuclear war, as President Trump is moving us toward, actually, in Iran, by talking about revoking the deal and probably restarting their nuclear program. The chance of war with Iran would erupt immediately, as was true half a century ago when I was in RAND and in the Pentagon. We always considered that initiating nuclear war in the case of conflict in Iran was essential. We couldn't match the Russians in that period. Okay, if you knew this, consider revealing that to Congress and the press, whatever the cost to you, even if the cost is what I faced, life in prison, what Chelsea Manning was charged with, actual possible life in prison. A world's worth of lives are at stake here. And I would say do what I wish I had done in '61, which was put out those documents then, or in '64, before the Pentagon War actually got started in a big way. Don't wait. As Martin Luther King says, there is such a thing as too late. And he talked of the fierce urgency of now. This crisis right now may awaken people in the Pentagon and in the public to the dangers we've been living with secretly for so long.
We will not, you see, my friends, let me stand up so that you can see me. You were not the subject of 8 years of war, where your cities were showered with missiles, carrying chemical warheads, and you did not have a single missile to retaliate so that maybe Saddam Hussein would stop. We went to one country after another, begging, insisting, begging for a single Scud missile to defend our people. Begging. Now, you want us to get a few dollars to Iran to abandon defending our people. We really hope and wish for a day when nobody will spend any money on any of these weapons. Actually, we're far ahead of many people because we spend a fraction of their expenditure on weapons. But we are entitled to the rudimentary means of defense, which we need in order to prevent another Saddam Hussein around the corner attacking us with chemical weapons. Because the international community has failed miserably in protecting the Iranian people, in safeguarding international humanitarian law. Saddam Hussein became the worst enemy of humanity, not when he was invading Iranian territory, killing Iranians with chemical weapons, but when he attacked Kuwait. For 8 years, he was people's darling. He was people's sweetheart. Go explain that to the Iranians and tell them for business community to feel nice about Iran, you should allow another Saddam Hussein to attack you. They'll tell you that we don't want that investment, but we are the safest, most stable, most business-friendly country in the region, where the investments will have the highest returns, and these weapons will never be used, because we will never, repeat, never, and get the same statement from those who are complaining, never use them against anybody, unless in self-defense, and we're sure that nobody has the guts again to attack us.